Is Huawei's so-called Tao's law something quite unique? Huawei says, "We've invented a new law." Let's not dive into logic folding, time shrinking, transistor density, or advanced packaging. Most people don't understand these terms. When someone bombards you with jargon you can't comprehend, they're likely trying to deceive you. It's like an old traditional Chinese medicine practitioner selling their wares, reciting some incantation. They probably don't understand it themselves, but after hearing it, you might believe them. We'll discuss the specifics of the Tao's law later. For now, let's not get bogged down in technical details. Today's key question isn't whether the Tao's law is original, how advanced it is, or if it truly breaks through bottlenecks. Today, we're exploring why Huawei repackaged a mature engineering method as a new law. Huawei has already invented Tao's law. You're saying he wants to suppress whom? There are so many domestic companies in the manufacturing industry, so many in the chip industry, and so many in the algorithm industry. Shouldn't you all unite under Huawei's banner, using Huawei's standards and Tao's law standards to move forward? Don't act independently. Huawei is actually watching this. While Huawei talks about the new law of semiconductors, it's all about a technological narrative. First, let's clarify what Huawei has released. On May 25, 2026, the International Symposium on Circuits and Systems was held in Shanghai, Dai. Huawei's board director and head of semiconductor business, He Tingbo, formally released Tao's law in his keynote speech titled Exploration and Practice of New Paths in Semiconductors. Tao is a Greek letter. We've used up all the names from the fancy words, so now we're moving on to ancient Greek mythology. Huawei's core arguments can be broken down into a few layers. First, the traditional path of Moore's law is becoming more challenging. Previously, the semiconductor industry primarily relied on geometric miniaturization, meaning the continuous reduction of transistor sizes. However, advanced processes are becoming more expensive, and issues like lithography materials, yield rates, power consumption, and interconnection delays are becoming increasingly difficult. We'll discuss this part later. Huawei proposes using time miniaturization to replace or supplement geometric miniaturization. The symbol tau is a common physical and engineering symbol, typically understood as a time constant. Huawei uses this symbol to emphasize the need for continuous reduction of signal propagation delays, experimental data transfer delays, and interconnection delays in systems, essentially reducing latency. Third, Huawei proposes logical folding, which simply means not just laying out logic circuits on a two-dimensional plane line. It is through advanced, three-dimensional packaging and easy-to-integrate systems that allow distant circuit modules to be brought closer together, reducing data movement and accelerating the overall system. Fourth Media reported that over the past 6 years, Huawei has designed and mass-produced 381 types of chips based on this approach. They have also announced a goal to achieve the equivalent of a 1.4 nanometer process for high-end chip transistor density by 2031. This is more than just a slogan. There are several pieces of information to consider. Huawei has indeed released a set of laws, which is a fact. Huawei has proposed a comprehensive design path that includes not only chip design but also chip interconnection and various software components, all coordinated to improve performance. Over the past 6 years, they have mass-produced 381 types of chips, indicating a high level of maturity. Additionally, they have outlined a future vision, aiming to reach the equivalent of a 1.4 nanometer process by 2031. However, there is a conceptual switch here. The claim for 2031 involves achieving a 1.4 nanometer equivalent process. Due to being restricted from purchasing the most advanced lithography machines and other materials, Huawei asserts that they do not need them, suggesting they can achieve similar results. However, it remains unclear how this will be accomplished, or if it is even possible. It is doubtful that this goal will ever be reached, because the underlying technology has already been in use by others, who continue to advance their processes. Without access to high-end processes, it is challenging to match these advancements through mere design and compression. Furthermore, this approach was not invented by Huawei. All these things, like the law of conservation of mass, have been around for a long time. For example, Some tech enthusiasts might notice that AMD's chips often have a 3D suffix, like AMD 5900X 3D. This 3D refers to the three-dimensional stacking of the chip. Normally, we would place the chip on one layer and put the startup circuit beside it, allowing quick access to the content inside. However, if we can't place it beside the chip anymore, we can stack it on top or bottom, creating a 3D structure. By using more interconnects to link them together, we avoid the space issues that come with placing circuits beside the chip. If we place them beside, too many interconnects will take up space, and too few will result in insufficient bandwidth. So, AMD started doing this early on. Intel also does the same thing, using 3D technology to stack different chips and components. NVIDIA's Blackwell chip also incorporates similar technology. Qualcomm hasn't explicitly mentioned 3D stacking, but they combine different chip components into one, which they call chapeljet. This is also part of what the law of conservation of mass requires. Additionally, we often talk about HBM, which stacks multiple DRAM chips vertically and connects them, forming a 3D stacked effect to achieve the highest speed. Everyone is doing this. Everyone is busy, so why does it feel like this technology hasn't gained much traction? Everything has its trade-offs. After 3D stacking, you'll encounter several issues you can't avoid. The first problem is heat dissipation. When you spread out a large flat surface, it dissipates heat well. But when you stack it into a 3D structure, it becomes much harder to dissipate heat. That's why, after 3D stacking, devices like the Blackview can only operate at night, as the heat becomes unmanageable. The second major issue is the reduction in yield rates. Originally, each chip was separate, so if one went bad, you could simply replace it. The yield rate wouldn't be affected. However, when you stack multiple chips together in 3D, if one chip fails, the entire stack is ruined. When calculating yield rates, for example, if you have 4 chips to stack with a 50% yield rate each, the probability that all 4 will remain functional after stacking is 50% multiplied by 50%, which is a very small number. Therefore, the yield rate decreases after stacking, which is why technologies like HBM are so expensive. The third problem is that design optimization becomes more complicated. For instance, imagine a large flat city now transformed into a vertical metropolis with numerous skyscrapers. After building the additional floor, I realized it's still inconvenient to travel from my place to yours. I have to go down from my floor, then up to yours just to reach your home. This is quite inconvenient. What if we build a sky bridge between our 2 apartments? I could directly go from my balcony to yours, making the trip much faster, right? This kind of stacking is often done for such purposes. But if everyone does this, it will look like the messy electrical poles in India. At this point, we need EDA for optimization and planning. For example, I live here, work there, and crossing a sky bridge gets me to the dining area downstairs. Nearby, there's a place to shop and a small clinic. This way, everything is connected. In the past, many cities had separate residential, office, commercial, and entertainment districts, causing traffic congestion between them. Now we can optimize this small area to include residential, office, and medical zones, reducing the need for travel. However, if everyone doesn't optimize together, it becomes problematic. That's why Huawei says we need a standardized approach, the addition theorem, so everyone follows the same standard. Once unified, everything connects seamlessly. But there's another issue. Once you standardize in one direction, it becomes difficult to adapt to other needs. Essentially, you've trained a city or built a system for a specific purpose. Now, if I want to change the city's function, it becomes challenging. If one wants to do something else, the versatility and generalization capabilities will be slightly inferior. Consequently, there will be many such problems. You might ask, why do companies like NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, Qualcomm, SK Hynix, and those using HBM all follow this path, but only Huawei mentions Moore's law? The reason is that, as previously discussed, Huawei needs to integrate everyone following its lead. Other companies do not have this need. For instance, AMD has developed a 3D chip, but it still operates within the x86 standard. ARM does not need to overhaul everything, It does not need to tell everyone that all components, including the motherboard and buses, must be designed according to its specifications. There is no such need. AMD only needs to inform users that it has employed 3D stacking technology for the CPU, and that it remains compatible with existing systems, causing no issues. Intel is doing something similar. The main difference here is that NVIDIA says, I have a complete system. I've implemented 3D stacking, used HBM, and included NVLink along with a host of other system components. Once I've developed a chip, we have a fully enclosed system. This approach ties everything together more tightly. NVIDIA is moving in this direction, but it does not proclaim any kind of law. NVIDIA is focused on selling chips and systems. It does not need to unify everything by insisting that everyone must gather around its technology. Currently, everyone is still concerned with antitrust issues and is clustered under its umbrella. However, Huawei is saying, I hope that all chip makers, system designers, and innovators in China will unconditionally choose my path and follow it without question. You can't just run around recklessly and combine this 3D stacking technology with other optimizations, patching things together, and then proposing a law to claim it as your own. Everyone is rushing to me, saying that I am the only standard. Ultimately, I hope to break America's restrictions and achieve national rejuvenation. Anyone who opposes me is disloyal to God or betraying the nation. He has elevated this matter to such a height. Therefore, what Huawei is doing now is not just a technology release, but a call to mobilize an ecosystem. If Huawei were only making chips, it wouldn't need to release this law. It would be like AMD making 3D chips. No need to tell you how great the chips are. Just be compatible with everyone and they can install and use them. Within Huawei, meetings can be held at HiSilicon, and architectural EDA software can be developed. You can adapt the packaging routes yourself and push them forward. Things like Kirin and Ascend can be developed however you want. There are no issues with that. There is no need to take a Greek letter, package it as a new semiconductor law, and do this. What Huawei wants is not for you to understand the law, but to use a bunch of terms you don't understand to brainwash everyone, especially those who are unaware. What Huawei wants is leadership in the domestic semiconductor ecosystem, meaning that in the future, I will call the shots. The direction of advanced chips will follow Huawei's narrative. Huawei is not talking about chip design, but rather that domestic semiconductors can't wait for UV anymore. We can't just focus on TSMC, Intel, and Samsung's geometric compression. We need our own path. This path is called the Dao law. Whoever defines the Dao defines the next stage of China's chip mainstream. This statement carries significant weight because once this narrative is established, many things will be rearranged. First, domestic EDA software will be modified around Huawei's issues. In the future, if you want to use EDA software because of the US ban, you'll have to use domestic EDA software, which means optimizing according to Huawei's framework. Second, domestic chip design concepts will be renamed by Huawei. What was once called advanced process windows, FinFETs, and 3D stacking will now all be referred to as the Dao law. These concepts were already there, but will now be unified under this term. Third, the domestic ecosystem will be thoroughly tied to Huawei's product line. Anything that isn't compatible with Huawei won't work. You must be compatible with Huawei. In the future, when making purchases, people will first ask if it complies with the Dao law. If it doesn't comply with the Dao law, it won't be satisfactory. Huawei has done similar things in the past with Hongmeng, ARC Compiler, and CAN. Hongmeng is a particularly typical example. The technologies it uses are not all original, they're pieced together from various sources. But once it's said that the Hongmeng system is different from others, it gains traction. In the smartphone industry, apart from Huawei itself, everyone else, including Honor, uses Android. No one is willing to make the effort to switch. Currently, only Huawei uses the HarmonyOS on its phones. For other devices like televisions and various gadgets, HarmonyOS is not yet widely adopted. While people say they can be compatible with HarmonyOS, they are not ready to commit fully. Regarding office systems and PC software, Using Harmonios is also not straightforward. Previously, it was mentioned that Harmonios aims to leverage open-source software, but Huawei lacks a clear concept of how to maintain an open-source system or architecture. It's similar to someone boasting about having divine connections, only to end up in chaos. The ARC compiler is essentially a suite of open-source tools including components from Microsoft and others, optimized for Harmonios. CAN is their alternative to CUDA. Huawei's ultimate goal is to control the ecosystem, but this is challenging because of self-interest. A company with tens of thousands of employees may not be willing to follow the ecosystem, such as Moore's Law or other chip-making companies, including other companies in the industry that make motherboards and new startups. Are we supposed to follow Huawei? Huawei has everything, from chips to servers. Who would want to follow them? Ultimately, don't deify the engineering path. What Huawei is doing now is essentially deifying the engineering path. You mentioned Moore's Law. Does it work? Because so many advanced companies worldwide have already verified it. Can Tao's Law break through the blockade? Nonsense. After using 3D stacking and all these technologies, they still need to pursue high-performance computing. For example, AMD's 3D chips still need to go to 7nm, 5nm, 3nm. No one can escape this. After stacking and doing everything related to Moore's Law, they just don't call it by that name. You still have to pursue high-performance computing. You can't avoid it. You're not saying that others haven't seen this. Others haven't moved towards 3D stacking or this logical stacking method. Only you have moved forward. You think you don't need to follow everyone else, but everyone is already using these technologies and moving forward. You can't make up for this. Now, you're proposing this high-sounding name with the sole goal of hijacking the situation. After hijacking, you still have selfish intentions and want to keep everything for yourself. In the end, this system might end up like the Harmonios we discussed earlier. Huawei is shouting loudly, and some people are willing to follow because of the high slogans. However, those who truly understand the domestic companies making AI chips, they all have experience with AMD, NVIDIA, Intel, and others. Everyone knows these things are nothing new. Recently, NVIDIA Jason Wang stated that Huawei's Tao Law is nothing new. The ideas behind Tao's Law, reducing signal delay, optimizing interconnects, and focusing on time rather than geometry, have already been explored for years by TSMC, NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, and the broader semiconductor industry. Tao's Law reframes existing engineering principles, not new physics. There are some Chinese analysts themselves warn against overhyping Tao's Law. A Fudan University commentary explicitly says, Tao's Law should not be overestimated. It is still far from industry consensus. Overseas giants are already advancing similar system-level optimization. As any semiconductor engineer would recognize, Tao's Law is not a breakthrough in physics. It is essentially a repackaging of long-standing industry practices, interconnect optimization, 3D stacking, and system-level co-design that companies like TSMC, NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel have been advancing for years.